There is something many women have never truly understood about men. Most men do not become deeply devoted simply because a woman is beautiful, perfect, or highly skilled at pleasing them. In fact, some women do not chase, do not constantly demand attention, and do not rely on manipulation at all. Yet men naturally feel drawn to care for them, protect them, and invest in them more deeply. What is interesting is that this dynamic has very little to do with weakness or acting dependent in order to be loved, which is what many people assume. It has far more to do with the deeper psychology of men, especially the emotional layers many men spend their entire lives hiding behind the mask of masculinity society teaches them to wear. Many men grow up believing they must always appear strong. They are taught that emotions are weakness, that a valuable man must always stay in control, succeed, provide, endure pressure, and constantly prove his worth through performance and achievement. Over time, many men begin living behind a version of themselves that has been socially conditioned. A version that always pretends to be fine, even when internally exhausted. And this is exactly what the mask of masculinity explores. Most men are not truly loved for who they are. They are often valued for the role they perform, for the strength they project, for their ability to provide, protect, and suppress vulnerability. And over time, many men lose connection with the softer, more human parts of themselves they no longer feel safe expressing. That is why there is a certain type of woman who unconsciously makes men soften around her. Not because she is trying to keep a man, but because her energy makes him feel like he no longer has to wear the mask all the time. When a man feels seen without being judged, respected without being controlled, and trusted without constantly needing to prove his value, something deeply instinctive begins to happen inside him. He naturally wants to give more, to care more, to protect the peace that this woman brings into his life. And this is where many women misunderstand men. They believe men spoil women because those women know how to demand more. But in reality, deep masculine investment rarely comes from pressure. It comes from the emotional experience a woman creates inside a man. A woman who constantly makes a man feel judged will slowly make him emotionally withdraw. A woman who makes him feel like he is never enough will eventually exhaust him emotionally. But a woman who makes a man feel safe enough to return to the most genuine version of himself often creates a much deeper emotional attachment. That is why many highly successful men eventually become most drawn to women who bring peace to their nervous system. Because after constantly carrying pressure in the outside world, what many men secretly crave is not endless admiration. It is the feeling that they can lower their guard without being diminished for it. And ironically, the women who do not try to manipulate men are often the ones men feel most compelled to give to. Because they do not create obligation. They create willingness. A man may do something out of pressure for a short period of time, but only genuine emotional connection creates long-term devotion. In this video, we are going to explore what truly makes men become deeply devoted to a woman, why certain women naturally receive care and emotional investment without needing to control or demand it, and what the deepest emotional weak spot inside men actually is, something very few people truly understand. 1. Men need to feel meaningful. One of the deepest emotional needs many men carry, even if they rarely talk about it openly, is the need to feel meaningful in the life of the woman they love. Not used, not controlled, not worshipped, but genuinely meaningful. This is something many people misunderstand about masculine psychology. A man may initially be attracted by beauty, chemistry, excitement, or physical desire, but what often determines whether he continues investing emotionally over time is whether he feels that his presence actually matters. Because most men do not naturally sustain effort in places where they feel emotionally unnecessary. And this goes much deeper than money, gifts, or providing in the traditional sense. At the emotional level, many men are constantly asking themselves one silent question: do I make this woman's life feel better in some meaningful way? When the answer feels like yes, something instinctive begins activating inside him. He becomes more attentive, more protective, more willing to give, not because he is being forced to, but because contribution is deeply tied to masculine identity for many men. This is why the women who are deeply cared for are often not the loudest, most demanding, or most controlling women in the room. In many cases, they are the women who create emotional stability around a man instead of emotional exhaustion. A man who constantly feels criticized, dismissed, emotionally tested, or treated like he is never enough will slowly begin disconnecting emotionally. Even if he stays physically present, part of him starts shutting down internally. Because when a man feels that nothing he does is truly valued, effort slowly begins to feel emotionally pointless. But when a woman creates an environment where a man feels respected, emotionally safe, and appreciated for who he is beyond performance alone, he often begins investing in ways that feel surprisingly natural. And this does not mean a woman has to become submissive, emotionally dependent, or constantly praise a man's ego. That is not what emotionally healthy masculine devotion is built on. Men do not feel deeply fulfilled by fake admiration. They feel fulfilled when they feel emotionally trusted and genuinely respected. There is a major difference between feeding a man's ego and nourishing his sense of purpose. A woman who constantly tries to manipulate a man through validation often creates insecurity inside the relationship. But a woman who calmly allows a man to feel useful, valued, and emotionally welcomed often awakens his desire to care for her voluntarily. Because when a man feels like he has a meaningful place in your emotional world, he naturally becomes more invested in protecting that place. And interestingly, this is one of the reasons emotionally stable women tend to receive deeper long-term investment from men. Their emotional energy does not constantly force a man into survival mode. He does not feel like he is walking into emotional chaos every time he interacts with her. Instead, he feels grounded, accepted, respected. For many men, that feeling becomes incredibly rare, especially in a world where many men secretly feel that they are only valued for what they produce, achieve, or provide. Very few men feel emotionally seen beyond their performance. Very few feel that they can simply exist without constantly proving themselves. That is why a woman who creates emotional steadiness without emasculating a man often becomes unforgettable to him. She becomes associated with relief, with emotional rest, with psychological safety. And when a man feels psychologically safe with a woman, he often begins giving more naturally than any amount of pressure could ever force him to. 2. Respect his core sense of pride. One of the deepest emotional weak spots in male psychology is pride. Many people think men are most afraid of failure, losing money, or losing control. But at a deeper level, what many men truly fear is the feeling of being seen as inadequate. That is why so many men spend their entire lives building an image of strength. Not only for society, but sometimes even inside relationships. They try to become more successful, more composed, more logical, less emotionally vulnerable. And behind all of that is often a very quiet fear. The fear of being looked down on once their weaknesses become visible. This is also why men tend to react very strongly when they feel emotionally diminished inside a relationship. Not necessarily because they always want control, but because for many men, feeling respected is deeply connected to feeling loved. A man may endure enormous pressure in the outside world, but if inside his relationship he constantly feels mocked, dismissed, compared, belittled, or made to feel like he is not man enough, he will slowly begin shutting down emotionally. And interestingly, many women unintentionally wound a man's pride without realizing it. Sometimes it is sarcasm in front of other people, constant criticism instead of constructive communication, comments that quietly diminish his competence, or using his vulnerabilities against him during conflict. For women, these moments may feel like temporary emotional reactions, but for many men, they strike directly at the part of themselves they work hardest to protect. And this is where emotionally intelligent women become different. They understand that respecting a man does not mean lowering themselves or becoming submissive. It means having emotional awareness in the way they handle a man's sense of dignity. An emotionally mature woman does not try to destroy a man's masculine structure simply to prove power inside the relationship. She does not turn love into a constant battle for dominance, because she understands something very important. When a man feels respected, he naturally becomes more emotionally open. This does not mean women should stay silent about unhealthy behavior or tolerate emotional immaturity. Healthy respect must always exist alongside boundaries. But there is a major difference between communicating problems with maturity and constantly making a man feel diminished as a person. Many women believe men simply want admiration, but what most men truly crave goes much deeper than that. They want to feel that even when they are imperfect, the woman they love still does not look down on them. Because most men rarely feel allowed to be vulnerable in the outside world. They are expected to remain strong at work, inside responsibility, and within the pressure of providing and carrying life on their shoulders. And because of that, when they enter relationships, what creates deep attachment is not only attraction or emotional intensity. It is the feeling that they can be seen fully as human while still keeping their dignity intact. That is why women who know how to protect a man's self-respect through the way they communicate often leave a profound emotional impact on him. Not because they are feeding male ego, but because they understand that every human being has emotionally sensitive places they are trying to protect from the world. And ironically, when a man feels genuinely respected, he often becomes much softer emotionally, less defensive, less obsessed with proving himself, less controlling, because he no longer feels like he is living inside an environment where he must constantly fight to protect his value. And that is often the moment a man finally begins loving from the most authentic part of himself, instead of only through the masculine mask he has spent years learning to wear. 3. The difference between being liked and being respected. One of the biggest mistakes many women make in relationships is believing that being deeply liked is the same thing as being deeply respected. At first, the two can look very similar. A man may chase you intensely, text you constantly, become emotionally obsessed, crave your attention, or seem unable to stay away from you. And because the emotional intensity feels strong, many women assume this automatically means the relationship has depth. But attraction and respect are not the same thing. A man can strongly desire a woman and still not truly value her. He can become emotionally attached while still remaining emotionally immature. He can enjoy a woman's presence, attention, beauty, softness, or emotional energy without actually seeing her as someone he deeply respects at a core level. And this is where many women become confused. Because being liked creates emotional highs. It feels exciting, desired, addictive. There is passion, pursuit, chemistry, emotional tension, and constant emotional stimulation. But feelings based purely on emotional attraction are often unstable because they are heavily tied to emotional consumption. Many forms of liking are still rooted in possession. A man may want constant access to a woman because of how she makes him feel emotionally. He may enjoy her attention because it feeds his ego, comforts his loneliness, regulates his emotions, or gives him validation. But that does not always mean he has reached the level of emotional maturity where he genuinely honors her value as a human being. This is why some men can intensely pursue women they never truly planned to protect emotionally. Because desire alone does not automatically transform a man's character. Respect does, and this is where relationships begin changing at the deepest level. Respect is different because it is not built only on emotion. It is built on perception. It comes from the way a man sees a woman psychologically. The moment a man truly respects a woman, his behavior begins changing from the inside out. Not because she forced him to, not because she begged for better treatment, but because respect naturally creates internal accountability. When a man merely likes a woman, he often focuses on what he can receive emotionally from her. But when he respects her, he begins thinking much more carefully about how his behavior affects her. That is a completely different emotional dynamic, because genuine respect activates responsibility. This is why a man who respects a woman usually becomes more intentional without needing constant reminders. He starts keeping his word more carefully. He becomes more aware of consistency. He naturally thinks ahead. He considers her emotional well-being when making decisions. He becomes more protective of the relationship because losing her begins to feel meaningful. And the interesting part is that true respect cannot be manipulated out of a man. It cannot be forced through emotional games, jealousy tactics, pressure, or performance. In fact, the more someone tries to control respect artificially, the less authentic it becomes. Real respect develops when a man internally recognizes the emotional value of the woman in front of him. And women who are deeply respected by men usually share certain emotional qualities. They often have self-respect, emotional steadiness, clear boundaries, inner dignity. They do not abandon themselves for male attention. They are emotionally open without becoming emotionally chaotic. They know how to love without losing their center. This creates a very different experience for men psychologically, because many men are used to relationships built entirely on emotional reaction, drama, emotional testing, possessiveness, insecurity, validation cycles, temporary attraction. But when a man encounters a woman whose energy feels emotionally grounded, his perception of her changes. He no longer sees her as just someone exciting to experience emotionally. He begins seeing her as someone valuable to protect. 4. The skill of emotional restraint, emotional regulation. One of the most underrated qualities in feminine energy is emotional restraint. Not emotional suppression, not pretending not to care, but the ability to regulate emotions instead of becoming controlled by them. Because one of the biggest differences between emotionally reactive women and emotionally grounded women is not that one feels less. It is that one knows how to respond without losing self-control. Many people believe feminine power comes from emotional intensity, from expressing every feeling immediately, reacting impulsively, or forcing emotions into the center of every interaction. But in reality, emotional maturity often reveals itself through timing, awareness, and restraint. And this is one of the qualities that deeply affects masculine psychology. Women who are deeply cherished by men are often not the women who constantly explode emotionally every time they feel hurt. They are usually the women who understand emotional dynamics well enough to know when softness creates connection and when firmness creates respect. That balance changes everything. Because emotionally intelligent women do not react only based on what they feel in the moment. They also understand the emotional state of the person in front of them. They recognize that communication is not just about releasing emotion. It is about creating the right emotional environment for understanding to happen. This does not mean they ignore their feelings or tolerate disrespect. It means they know how to express themselves without unconsciously turning every emotional moment into emotional destruction. Many relationships slowly become emotionally exhausting because both people react only from wounded emotion. Someone feels hurt, so they attack. Someone feels ignored, so they withdraw. Someone feels insecure, so they create conflict to force reassurance. And over time, the relationship becomes a cycle of emotional reactions instead of emotional understanding. But emotionally regulated women move differently. When conflict appears, they do not immediately allow emotion to control the direction of the conversation. They pause long enough to understand what is actually happening beneath the surface. Sometimes they choose softness because they recognize the other person is already emotionally overwhelmed. Other times, they become firm because they recognize that too much softness would slowly invite disrespect. And this is where emotional intelligence becomes incredibly attractive. Because many men are secretly exhausted by relationships that constantly feel emotionally chaotic. Relationships where every disagreement immediately turns into emotional warfare. Where every difficult conversation becomes an explosion of blame, emotional punishment, or impulsive reactions. Over time, that kind of emotional instability slowly puts a man's nervous system into defense mode. He stops feeling emotionally safe. He becomes more guarded, less open, less emotionally present. But a woman who knows how to regulate herself creates a completely different emotional experience. She understands that emotional control is not weakness, it is power. She knows there are moments when a man's ego is already fragile, and adding unnecessary humiliation will only create more emotional distance. She knows there are moments when calmness is more effective than emotional escalation. And she also knows there are moments when silence, firmness, or boundaries are necessary to protect her own dignity. This is why emotionally mature women rarely feel emotionally unpredictable. Their reactions feel intentional instead of impulsive. A man does not constantly feel like he is walking through emotional landmines around them. And interestingly, this creates deeper emotional trust. Because when a man feels that a woman can handle emotional tension without immediately creating chaos, he naturally begins lowering his defenses. He becomes more honest, more emotionally available, more willing to communicate instead of shutting down. And this does not happen because she is easy or emotionally passive. It happens because emotional regulation creates psychological safety. One of the most powerful things a woman can develop is the ability to separate temporary emotion from long-term consequence. Emotionally reactive people often say things that permanently damage intimacy just to release temporary feelings. But emotionally grounded women understand that not every emotion deserves immediate expression in its rawest form. Sometimes, emotional maturity is knowing how to wait until clarity returns before responding. And this is especially important in masculine-feminine dynamics because many men instinctively pull away when they feel emotionally cornered or psychologically attacked. Not because they do not care, but because emotional overwhelm often activates defensiveness inside them. A woman who understands this dynamic does not constantly force emotional confrontation at the worst possible moments. She understands timing, tone, emotional pacing. She knows how to communicate in ways that preserve connection instead of destroying it unnecessarily. And ironically, this often gives her far more influence emotionally, because true feminine power is rarely loud. It is emotionally aware. It knows when tenderness creates closeness. It knows when boundaries create respect. It knows when silence is wiser than emotional reaction. And it knows how to remain emotionally centered without abandoning softness. That is why the women who are most deeply cherished by men are often not the women who demand emotional control over men. They are the women who first learned how to master control over themselves. In the end, the deepest form of masculine devotion is rarely built through pressure, emotional games, or constant demands for attention. A man may temporarily chase what excites his ego, but the kind of care that lasts usually comes from something much deeper inside him. It comes from emotional respect, because when a man encounters a woman who understands him without trying to control him, who sees through his emotional defenses without using his vulnerability against him, and who carries both softness and self-respect at the same time, something instinctive begins to happen inside him. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this video. If today's reflections resonated with you, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes, a simple conversation can open the door to something far deeper than we expect. And if you're drawn to feminine psychology, soft power, and the emotional depth behind human connection, subscribe to Velune Her so we can continue exploring the quiet influence of feminine energy together. I'll see you in the next video.